Well, this morning on Media and Society, we discuss the proposed SABC bill, its merits and its flaws. Well, hello and welcome to Media and Society. I am your host, Naledi Mulo. Of course, this is the show where we take a look at the intersection between the media and society. And of course, as usual, the show really isn't complete without your input. So over the next hour, feel free to give us a call on the number 011-714-0661 or 0662, or tweet us using the hashtag SABC Media Society. Well, this is our discussion this morning. The SABC has been hit by ever-increasing hard times over the last decade as it grapples with the change in the media and television landscape. The need to innovate and update forms of revenue collection is what has led to the new SABC bill, with submissions approved by government. The bill has brought out very strong opinions and many questions about the rationale behind some of the changes laid out on it. Today, we will be asking who exactly this new bill hopes to serve, and can the changes suggested see the broadcaster making competitive strides into the future? Joining us for this discussion, of course, is William Bird, who's the director at Media Monitoring Africa. We also are joined by Caxton, Chair of Journalism at Wits University and Director of the Campaign for Free Expression. Mr. Samgela Mukine is in studio with us, Executive Director at Freedom of Expression. We also are joined by the Caxton Chair of Journalism, Professor Anton Harbour, who joins us via Teams. We're joined as well by Dr. Dale McKinley, who is an independent writer, researcher, analyst and political analyst, and Dr. Ndo, who is a media and political analyst. Gentlemen, a good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I think this is particularly a really difficult discussion. And I want to start with the basics and not take for granted that the viewers understand what we're doing here. William, I'm going to let you set the tone for us. Let's start with the backdrop before we actually talk about what the bill intends to do. Your view as Media Monitoring Africa as the state of the SABC from a funding model point of view.
It's outdated, it's inadequate, it's not fit for purpose, it's just, it's destined to see the SABC crash. It's something that needed to be changed decades ago. We've been calling on government and Parliament to change, to look into to research it, review it, come up with alternatives. We've put forward alternatives in countless policy proposals, and yet they've done precisely nothing. And in fact, what this latest bill does is precisely nothing once again, which is to say it offers exactly the same funding model with a few tweaks. And it's then, in addition to that, it gives the minister a great deal more power. So what the state of the SABC is absolutely dire. It's, you know, we are getting to the point where, again, you're having to deal with an institution in crisis or going into a deepening crisis, instead of one that's starting to emerge from a crisis, which is the point that we started to get to. Yet again, government has failed it. You know, they failed it by shutting off the audiences for 40% of the SABC's audience. They switched off the analog signal, and then they didn't appoint a board for 7 months. And then you wonder why the SABC is facing even more dire financial crisis, to the extent that our screen's not working in the studio and that there's no air conditioning. Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult position to be in. I'm going to let you take over here, Samgela, and just talk to us about, you know, your view as SOS, as the Freedom Expression Institute. How do you describe the state of the South African Broadcasting Corporation?
It's dire and it's urgent. And I think in the latest SABC bill, there's no sense of urgency. People are still talking about coming up with a funding model framework. There's not even talk yet about a funding model, which, as William indicated, is something that we need, and we need urgently. So there's no urgency of an institution that's in crisis, and we are going into an elections next year. So it's not looking good at all.
Yeah, I'm going to bring the same question to our guests that are joining us via teams? Because I'm trying to get a sense of if there is some optimism about the state of the public broadcaster as it sits, what its future prospects are from the viewpoint of our analysts. I'm going to start with you, Professor Anton Harber. We've had these discussions multiple times on this very platform about the state of the SABC. I mean, where's the optimism for you? Professor Harber? I think your mic is off.
I'm
Prof.
sorry.
There we go. Go ahead.
My apologies. I was saying optimism lies with the people who day to day keep it running and keep the show on air and do the best they can to report on the country. But what's interesting about the bill, that it reflects the priorities, and you can see it in the bill. It's most important because the two things most clearly is a failure to deal with problems of funding of SABC. It proposes it for another 3 years. The bill says a company.
Okay, we're struggling a little bit with that line, Prof. We're struggling a little bit with that line, and I think this might have something to do with network issues. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a short break, and we'll be back in a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back. Well, you're still watching Media and Society with myself, Naledi Moleo. A technical challenge there, leading us to then move studios so that we are able to continue the conversation. Of course, also really bringing up the importance of us having the conversation around the SABC bill this morning with the various challenges that the public broadcaster is facing. Does the bill really do the work that's necessary to bring some of the funding challenges that the SABC has to book? We are in conversation still with William Burr, Director of Media Monitoring Africa, Samkelo Mukine, who's the Executive Director at the Freedom Expression Institute and Chair of the SOS Coalition, Dr. Levi Ndo, who is a political and media analyst, Dr. Dale McKinsley, an independent writer and researcher, as well as Professor Anton Harber, who is Caxton Chair of Journalism at Wits University. I think, Prof, just before we went into that very long break there, Prof. Harber, I had asked you about where the optimism are and where the optimism is, and I'm going to let you respond to that and help us find where the optimism is.
The optimism lies with the people who keep SABC on air and who keep it running day to day. It certainly doesn't come from government and its handling of it. You know, what I find most interesting about the new bill is what it says about government priorities, because the new bill doesn't deal with the funding crisis at the SABC, which is the most fundamental crisis. But it does increase the minister's capacity to interfere in the SABC. So clearly that's more important in the pre-election period than fixing the SABC.
Yeah. Let me bring in Dale McKinley, the independent writer, researcher, and analyst, and I'm going to bring it to studio because I think the discussion here is going to be even more difficult than what we're going to have on Zoom, and that's why I want to take it to the digital space first. Dr. Dale McKinley, is there a funding model, though, that can work for the SABC? Perhaps we should start there. And are we seeing enough efforts to try and get to that?
Well, thanks, Naledi. As has been already mentioned, I mean, this is like a mouse going around in a little circle for the last 10 or 15 years in respect to the funding model. The fundamental problem is you have a public mandate for the SABC, and you don't have the funding to meet that mandate. This is an unfunded public mandate. This has always been the case. So this commercial entity that's being established has been done before. We've seen this. The cross-subsidization does not work. So basically, you're pouring fuel on the fire. Yes, of course, there are alternatives. The first one would be, obviously, a public expenditure. If you run the SABC efficiently like most state enterprises and pump money into proper programming and staff and capacitation, we will get a good public broadcaster. Simple as that. And public money will be well spent. Ad revenue will come through much better. You don't have to necessarily have two separate commercial and public entities. You can have that into one space. And also looking at tax, for example, media, taking away this license situation, which doesn't work, and basically putting other taxes onto those that can afford them. Just like if you want proper cross-subsidization, that's the way to do it. So there are funding models across the world in public broadcasters that we can take from, that we can make work. It seems to me, and I think this is what the message is coming across, and we've seen this in Eskom, Transnet, Post Office, all the state-owned enterprises. There's simply not the political will to make public enterprises work efficiently and to put the money where the mouth is, essentially. So when you do that, you're going to have a crisis, ever-increasing crisis, not only in the SABC, but across the public enterprises board. And that's the fundamental problem, is we have a political problem. It's not just an institutional infrastructural problem.
Yeah, of course, I do need to mention that the Media and Society team did, of course, reach out to SABC management, certainly the board, and we were unable to get confirmation for them. They simply were not able to join us for this interview. We had also reached out to the Minister of Communications office, and his office essentially sent us a message saying that the process has been completed from Cabinet side and that the bill is essentially in the parliamentary process. In fact, this is the message that we got from the Minister's office. It says, "Good day. The bill as approved by Cabinet is now a parliamentary process and will undergo the legislative process of public comments when approved by Parliament. It is no longer in the hands of the department. It is advisable that you liaise with the parliamentary committee once the bill has been formally presented to them." We did, of course, reach out to the parliamentary committee, and they too declined an offer to join us here on the show. Dr. Ndo, perhaps you'd like to say something about that. I mean, where's the accountability for how we actually keep the SABC running and keep South Africans informed as a public broadcaster?
Well, Naledi, I think what is important is to go back to the basics. Why do we have the SABC? What would be the best mode of ensuring that the public gets informed on a regular basis? At the same time, you need government that is able to say, let us have an institution that is given all the space to be able to deliver on its mandate and ensure that every South African is able to get whatever kind of information that is necessary. At the same time, there has been issues relating to the funding of the SABC. And in my view, this is not a matter that we should still be discussing today. I will take it to those that have been running the SABC for some time at a board level and at a managerial level, that what impact or what are the proposals that they've made that could contribute to the proper functioning of the SABC in terms of funding and also in terms of human resources. We all know that in terms of the funding model, which the bill says still has to be developed in the next 3 years, it's something that we should be trying to implement something new, because what has been going on for quite some time has not worked. If you talk about people or relying on people who have to pay for TV licenses, that has actually not worked as well. So you need to have very innovative ways to ensure that the SABC is actually running. As for the interference or direct interference of government, my sense is that if you've got the board and when you have got strong management team, you don't need any other form of interference. All you do is to ensure that the board, the entity is properly funded, and at the same time, it delivers exactly on its mandate.
I'm going to bring it back to studio. Samgelo, I'm going to start with you. You've literally just seen us move from one studio to another in the middle of a show. I mean, you can talk to us a little bit about what you are seeing as the state of the public broadcaster?
Yeah, there's a, in terms of infrastructure investment, there's a dire need for it. You can't put it any other way. And, it still goes down to the crux of the matter, which is funding the public mandate at the SABC. If you do not fund that and properly fund the SABC, you're going to be in trouble.
Why are we still holding on to TV licenses as a funding model?
It's a mystery, because that has been proved not to work, and all indications are that even less and less people are paying for their TV licenses. That's a complete mystery.
Is that a campaign matter? Are we not adequately campaigning to South Africans to pay their TV licenses? And maybe that's the issue: is that we're giving into the culture of non-payment. This is also
part of it is that there was a story just the other day that says that government apparently owes 55 million rand in unpaid TV licenses. So government's not even paying theirs. Never mind doing the right thing. They don't know anything to do, apparently. No wonder they don't want to come on the show, because this bill is such a diabolical, disgusting embarrassment that no one should want to even appear with their names next to it. So at least I can understand why they didn't want to come and justify it, because it's unjustifiable. So to that extent, I think we should just say, let's take this bill and put it where it should be, in the bin, and look at what we actually need to be doing, right? Because the rest, it's not even worth engaging on it. It's so fundamentally flawed. What we need to be saying is, TV licenses were working, but what you start to get is when you don't invest in programs, when you get less and less local content, when you get the rise of the streaming services and so many alternatives now, you get decreasing audiences, decreasing advertising, less people want to pay because they're seeing less value coming from their TV license. So it isn't necessarily purely the institution of a TV license that's at fault. It's about the fact that this isn't a crisis that started today, last week, last year, or even the last 5-10 years. This is a crisis that started 2 decades ago or more, where we'd said, again, this is what's coming, prepare. Instead of engaging now on issues of saying, how do we deal with SABC and public broadcasting in a digital environment? How do we make sure that the SABC public broadcasting is able to be distinguishable from other content? What makes it different from these other streaming services? How do we protect the news and current affairs, the integrity of those things? We're now still stuck discussing, oh wow, we don't have a studio to go into because the equipment's so old that it breaks down continuously, right? That's where we should be, and in fact we aren't. But as Dale pointed out, that's a political problem. This is, so you can do certain things, and of course there are things that need to change within the SABC structures itself, but primarily this is a political issue that government has failed repeatedly. Parliament has failed the SABC and the public of South Africa by addressing this in any meaningful manner.
Yeah, I want to take a short break, and then when we come back, we're going to really talk about some of the, I suppose, the steps that the SABC really has tried to take to cut back on expenditure. If there have been moves in the right direction, we're going to take a short break. We're going to get into that after this. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're still watching Media and Society with myself, Naledi Mulo. We continue our conversation around the funding model and the support for the SABC, the proposed SABC bill that is now going through parliamentary processes, and conversation still with William Bird of Media Monitoring Africa, Caxton Chair of Journalism at Wits University, Professor Anton Harber, the Director for the Campaign for Freedom for Free Expression, Mr. Samkelo Makine. We're also joined by Dr. Levi Ndo, who is a media and political analyst, and Dr. Dale McKinley, who is a independent writer, researcher, analyst, and political activist. I wanted to talk before we went into that break about some of the chances, or I suppose the opportunities that the SABC has taken to really cut back on expenditure. We've seen shows that one has considered particularly expensive cut off of the SABC bill, for instance. We've seen perhaps even the end of shows like Seven Delan. I mean, have we made the right decisions, Prof. Harber, in how with the funding model as it sits? Have we taken the right decisions in terms of cutting back on expenditure as a broadcaster?
With just cutting back on expenditure and not investing in fresh local programming, new technology, etc., is that you put yourself on a downward spiral. You don't invest, you therefore lose the audience, you therefore find it harder to get the political and financial support you need. There's no question that the financial issues are difficult and tough. I accept that. It's true for all media at these times. But you have to invest in the basics, which is to get the audience with good, fresh programming, to stick with the long shows that are popular and draw the audience, and to invest in the technology as well. There's no way around that. That's the bottom line. Otherwise, you're just on a downward spiral.
Yeah. I want to bring this to you, Samkelo, because I think as Save Our SABC, you, like me, are able to have, a very close-up look at what's really going on inside. Prof. Harbour there's talking about investing even in infrastructure. I mean, just how dire is that situation? Earlier on, when we had to move studios, you talked about, you wonder what other parts of the building look like from an infrastructural point of view.
Yeah, and we shouldn't just be looking at the TV side. I mean, it's across the board, the SABC radio as well. Yeah. And, it being the most widely accessed media throughout the Republic, it's not only a pity, but it's a disservice and impact on freedom of expression and the right of people to access information, especially when you are going into an elections and people will be campaigning and people have to make choices about who they're going to vote for. And now we still have people, politicians prioritizing how they should, through the bill, how they should be interfering in the SABC rather than making it a properly funded institution. That's sad.
Yeah, Dr. Ndo, I'm going to bring you in here. And as Samkelo mentions, that we're getting closer and closer to national and provincial elections. It's a critical time where access to information is so important for the public. And it also makes me think of how just a week ago we were reporting on the state of the showgrounds in Tshwane, for instance, ahead of the elections. And I'm wondering, what the average South African must be feeling in the run-up to elections when we're thinking, well, do we have a venue for the elections, firstly? And then are we going to be given adequate quality information in the run-up to those elections? I mean, is this a human rights issue, Prof? Dr. Ndo?
Well, I think there is a general decline that relates to the maintenance of the infrastructure in South Africa. It is not only about the election center, it's about a number of facilities that we have in South Africa. There are a lot of stadiums that have been built in South Africa that are dysfunctional as we speak right now. There are a lot of government buildings that are not being maintained, and they're actually in a very, very bad state. And my view is that this is a culture that all of us should actually get involved and ensure that the decay of our infrastructure in South Africa is to be dealt with. But I want to look at the role of Parliament in this matter. We could consider ourselves very fortunate that we still have Parliament that still has to undergo all the other processes that relates to the bill. The biggest question would be, is there an interest on the part of our Parliament to save an entity like the SABC? Is there that zeal to say, as MPs, they could make a difference and give us something that we can be able to accept and appreciate and say, indeed, the SABC or Parliament has played a role in saving us. We're moving towards elections right now, and all members of Parliament and the public in general should be quite concerned about the state of the SABC and how they're actually going to be getting information. And my sense is that if there is one thing that Parliament has to do in the best interest of the citizens, is to ensure that when their term of office ends next year, they should move proudly and say, we've done something better to save the SABC.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, and I think I want to bring the same question to you, Dale McKinley, and say, are we facing here a human rights issue? And the reason why I raise it is because, again, and I quote the message that we got from the Communications Minister's office saying that, well, the bill is now going through a parliamentary process. It will be open to public comment, and one could easily argue that the public still has an opportunity to have a voice here. I mean, what do you say to that, Dale?
Well, I think this is part of a much broader crisis. Yes, access to information is in our Constitution. It's a constitutionally guaranteed right. We have a promotion of access to information bill. We have progressive legislation in this respect. But like in much things in our country, the legislation and the reality are two different things. But I wanted to put this in the broader perspective because I think there is a point that's being made here that this bill is a sort of, it's a wedge about a threat to a democratic dispensation. What do I mean by that? Is if you look at the lack of infrastructure, the lack of planning, the lack of alternative financial model, not just for the SABC, but for a lot of state-owned enterprises. And then you look at, for example, the General Intelligence Laws Amendment Bill that's before Parliament that's going to give more power to the State Security Agency. This bill, which gives more power to the ministers, other bills, centralization of authority. We're seeing across the world this same pattern where governments are basically trying to control information and ruling parties are trying to basically make it that they can essentially manipulate the information that comes, particularly around elections. And I'm not saying that there's some war room in the government or the ANC that's doing this, but the overall trajectory politically is very worrying. Because when citizens don't have access to information, when their public broadcasters are in crisis, when their public services are in crisis, then the government comes and basically cracks down and says this is the only option that you have and narrows the democratic space. We're not talking about just a crisis in the SABC or state-owned. We're talking about a crisis of democratic legitimacy. And I think that's the broader picture here that really is worrying. Because once you mess with public information and public broadcasting and public institutions, and you either privatize or basically run them down, what are we left with? We're left with the majority of the population that's left out of the democratic dispensation. Yeah,
I do want to say this, and I know that this sounds a bit defensive, but it is true that we're not off air. We are on air. And Prof. Harbour talked earlier about the optimism being in those that are inside the SABC towers working incredibly hard to keep these shows on air. And that's a reality. But there's something to be said perhaps about the quality of content then that we're putting out. And perhaps that it might be where, we're facing a rights issue depending on what your view is, Prof. Harbour. I'm going to bring it back to you. Because we can certainly say, well, the staff in the SABC is working incredibly hard to keep the programming on air. But the reality is, perhaps the question is, are we seeing a skills drain within the public broadcaster? Prof, your view there?
There's no doubt that we're seeing a skills drain, we're seeing a deterioration of infrastructure, and that these fundamentally affect the capacity of the SABC to fill its public mandate. It is very much a human rights issue. The right to speak out and be heard, the right to information, and to see and hear one's voices on the public broadcaster is a deeply important fundamental issue, because the right to speak gives you the right to fight for all your rights. Lose the right to speak can no longer defend your other rights. So it's that important.
Yeah. Samgelo, we can't forget that just over 2 years ago, SABC staff were hit with that massive Section 189. I mean, if you had walked through the passages of the SABC back then, you could feel just how thick the air was. People terrified for their future, not knowing whether or not they'd have a job. I remember a particular point where you had broadcasters breaking down on air during that process. Let's talk about what's happening inside. I mean, when you speak to staff members at Save Our SABC, what are you hearing?
I mean, this issue around staffing has been in progress for quite a long time, even though in some ways, management had to institute certain processes. And one of the sort of brighter areas around the SABs that must be acknowledged is that over the past 5 years, management has worked really hard And we've also got a board then and the new board that are quite capable men and women. And that's one of the other sort of bright sparks in this SABC issue. But it's unfortunate, the issue of staffing. These are people that are meant to enforce or make the issue around freedom of expression and access to information a reality. If they themselves are breaking down, that does not augur well.
Yeah, but you've got the staffing, and I remember even during that Section 189, there were videos that went viral of staff inside the SABC speaking out and saying, well, we've been here, we've been trying to keep the lights on and we've been working, and yet this is happening to us. You've got the same staffing that says we're fighting. You've got the changing board, and again, we can say, and not just at the SABC, let's talk about a lot of state-owned entities, right? We've got boards that are changing, and for the most part we say, well, you've got a capable and skilled board in place. What is happening? Then why do we have this? We've got a skilled board, you've got workers that are committed to getting the organization right. What is the common denominator among our state-owned entities? William, do you want to take that one?
Well, the political will, the shifts and how they deal with it, and the funding, the fact that broadcasting, SABC is still operating under the Broadcasting Act, which was amended in 2000. It's 23 years old. We haven't had a new policy. And yet it's expected to operate in an environment that is fundamentally different. So, there's only so long that you can have, staff who are willing to hold things together with bits of tape, duct tape and whatever to keep programs on air, etc., before things eventually break down beyond the point where it's that spiral is almost irreversible. And we are rapidly approaching that point. We were starting to emerge from that sense of perpetual crisis within the SABC, which is what led to SOS being formed. And now, you've got some level of stability with the previous board, but then you had government switch off analog signal, lose 40%, have no board for 7 months.
Yeah.
You're now operating in a scenario where you also haven't had a COO for 6 months, I think, somewhere around there. Where's the new COO? Why aren't we being updated as to where the new, the interviews, the advert went out some few months ago. That person, they should be responsible for what's happening here, making sure that there is that level of infrastructure. But again, you're dealing with an institution that was crafted post-democracy with apartheid relics to then try and see how we could possibly make this thing work for a democratic era. And since then, we've not done anything to its structure other than say, okay, let's have public, commercial, and this idea that the commercial services would somehow cross-subsidize the public. And in fact, it's always worked exactly the reverse. And yet government seems to think that that's still a viable option. It's just patently ridiculous, So you've got and the SABC has, like many of us in Johannesburg, haven't had water for 2 days. How do you let a national key point not have water for 2 days? There are thousands of people working here. What do you think they must do? It's like when you cut water from a hospital, it's the same level of severity. It impacts very serious things. And for that to be allowed to happen isn't an SABC issue. That's a broader national government infrastructure issue. The minister and cabinet need to account for this bill. The fact that they passed this, that they must have read it, some of them at least must have read it and thought, oh yes, we can accept this. The fact that they did that shows fundamentally on many levels that there's simply a complete break of reality of what's happening in the state and what's happening within the SABC, because people we speak to are scared, they're angry, they're feeling demotivated, all of the usual kinds of things you experience in a state when you're in consistent turmoil.
Yeah. Why does it matter? And I mean now for the viewer, right? Because perhaps someone who's watching SABC News could argue, well, I've got DSTV, it doesn't matter to me, I've got alternatives. Why does it matter? I want to stay with you. Why does it matter that we keep the SABC functional and in optimal position, in an optimum position?
One of the criteria that you find in countries that have high levels of trust in public institutions and in media is that they've got a central functional public service broadcaster. We saw during COVID how important credible, accurate, reliable media were to get out, disseminate information. In an election period, there's no one else, there's no other entity that has the breadth, the depth, the language diversity to deal with and address these issues. You collapse So you say, fine, I've got DSTV. Well, that's very nice if you're middle class, but for the overwhelming majority of people who aren't, that rely on radio, that rely on SABC TV for their news and information, this matters because fundamentally their rights matter too, just because government doesn't seem to think that they do.
Yeah, unfortunately we're out of time, but I want to bring in our guests that are joining us virtually. Dr. Ndo, just in 30 seconds, I mean, if you were COO, you know, throw the bones here, talk to me about what is the first thing you would do?
Well, I think I would have to look at the basics, ensuring that government has to provide sufficient space for the SABC to operate, but at the same time, be able to distribute the resources in a manner that the institution has to run effectively and efficiently. At the same time, ensuring that the employees of the entity are happy, they are encouraged to do their work and get very good salaries so that they actually do as expected.
Yeah. Prof. Harbour, put you in the position of power at the SABC, what would you do?
Look, I think it's absolutely essential that all those who care about the SABC, in the SABC, outside the SABC, the public, be insisting that government take this issue seriously. It's not that difficult to work out what needs to be done and what needs to be prioritized. The people in the SABC are doing what they can under difficult circumstances, but clearly they need to start to use political pressure to get the real issues on the national agenda.
Yeah, Dr. McKinley?
Yeah, what I would do would be I would bring the workers of the SABC, the supporters of the SABC together. You put together all those ideas and plans, and you start a campaign to the same campaign that was about saving our public broadcaster, but now includes the SABC itself. We're in a situation where our politicians are simply not going to move unless they feel the pressure to do so, unless they feel there's political cost in not doing so.
Yeah.
And if I was the SABC, I would enter into that terrain, because doing it in the halls and the back ways of Parliament and a new minister and everything have proven to be ineffective. Bring the public into your confidence, start the campaign, and let the public defend the public broadcaster and have that vision. The politicians will have to respond to that.
Yeah, that adds a to-do list for you then, Mr. Mokgine. Absolutely. So, as Executive Director of the Freedom Expression Institute and Chair of the Save Our SABC Coalition, what's next for you?
SOS stands ready to join hands with whoever wants to in order to make sure that we continue to support and save the SABC.
Yeah, who would you like to speak to?
I mean, across the board, whether be it faith-based organizations, any support, as Professor Harbour has said, both internally in the SABC, outside the SABC, so that I think there's a groundswell of talking together and support, so that we can really have an effect on the politicians.
Yeah, well, it's been certainly an enlightening conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen, and we appreciate the time that you have given to media and society. And that's where we wrap it up. Thanks to Dr. Dale McKinley, independent writer, researcher, analyst, and political activist, to Dr. Levi Ndoy, media and political analyst, to Samkelo Mokgine, who is the executive director at Freedom Expression Institute and chair of the SOS Coalition, Caxton chair of journalism at Wits University, Professor Anton Harbour, as well as William Bird, who's director at Media Monitoring Africa. That's how we wrap up Media and Society. Thank you for joining us. We're back again next week, Sunday, between 9 and 10, we promise.